So instead of having like a decree come down, it came very much in the form of a conversation. And of course, a really strong social media blitz at the same time, which is another big characteristic of today's Saudi Arabia. But of course, it's encompassed a lot more substantive changes as well. The plans for economic diversification are opening up new opportunities for women to work, which is something that we'll want to talk about. And also for the development of new industries and an emphasis, I think, that they brought up and came near the end of the last panel in different areas like entertainment and tourism that are a real kind of, some of these areas relatively untouched within Saudi Arabia. And also a new openness that we see to the arts and also to sports, which I'm really pleased that we'll have a chance to talk about on this panel. So joining me in this conversation to look at these really big social and cultural changes taking place in the kingdom are three Saudis who have been really astute observers and also in many cases participants in these changes that are taking place. I have here to my left Ahmed Omran. He's a Saudi journalist and correspondent, most recently with the Wall Street Journal, the Riyadh Bureau. And many of you probably got to know Ahmed way back in the early days when he was running a blog called Saudi Genes, which I think actually was really a pivotal blog that opened up the eyes to a lot of people in the West to changes and things that were taking place within Saudi society. He has his degree from the Columbia School of Journalism. Her Excellency Lina Almaeena is a member of Saudi Arabia's Shura Council. And before her recent appointment, it's very recent, right?
Absolutely.
She was a well-known writer and an active member of the Jeddah Chamber of Commerce. She also has a really fascinating background in sports and was the founder of Jeddah United, which I hope we get to hear more about, we're going to discuss here, which was the first local sports company that promoted sports, especially amongst women and also youth in the kingdom. And she's been working a lot on these issues of sports and inclusion in these areas. Hala Aldosari is with us at the Arab Gulf States Institute. She's a visiting scholar. Her research, original research and deep research, scholarly research that she's done is focused on women's health and the epidemiology of violence against women in Saudi Arabia. But she ventures, or she's been venturing much further beyond that to look at a lot of different issues of social change within Saudi Arabia. She directs and maintains a women's rights advocacy project online called Almaeena.org, and she participates very much as well in advocacy for women's rights and women's empowerment within the kingdom. So I'm thrilled to have all of them with me here today. And we're going to start with kind of like they did in the first panel with a lightning round, where I'd like to ask all of them just two key questions. What is the most important change that you've seen in the kingdom this year? And what's the most important change that you feel is still needed? And I will start with you, Ahmed, since you're next to me.
Okay, so I think the most important change, I would not specify a certain policy as the most important change. I think the most important change has been just this desire for change, this push for change. And for the first time, you have this major plan where the government basically detailing how they want to push for change in the country. Now, what's the second question?
What's the biggest change that's needed?
That's needed. I think you already kind of mentioned that in the introduction, which is the Vision 2030 in its announcement seemed very focused on economic change, and there is a lot of lack of specifics when it comes to what are the goals for social and cultural change that the government hopes to achieve. Now, the government might take the position that they don't want to be very specific about these goals, but in the lack of clarity for social and cultural change in this plan, this is opening for a lot of tension and possible conflicts between, how different groups of society see, where should this cultural and social change should go.
Excellency?
I'd agree with the first part, with the fact that it's very difficult for a country with different segments, age groups, and even just interests to prioritize one or two topics. I think that if I had a family member with special needs, then my priority would be integrating special needs in society, for example. And that goes to the same with custody. Custody would come second or third, for example, on my list. So honestly, pinpointing one or two issues, the most important thing that happened, so many things has happened in the past year. And so many more issues we need to be focusing on in the next coming years. So there's just so many things, I think, throughout the discussion of the panel. Hopefully we can talk more about it.
Well, I would say that for me, there are two things that I feel monumental that happened. The first one is what happens if the government withdraw their subsidies and support for people and ask people to search or be inventive and look for resources, because that's the test of how functional the institutions and how much is the gap in addressing major issues like employment and other issues. So I think that's a reality check for most Saudis that happened over the last year, and it's I would say it's a blessing in disguise. The other thing is the royal decree that was issued on 17th of April to instruct all governmental entities to review their restrictions when it comes to services provided to women, and to list all those orders or all the services that require the guardian permission. For me, that is a recognition of a main impediment that faces women on so many levels. But of course, as my colleagues say, there is no one thing that is needed. I think what is needed is the vision. I think that's the main thing that is still lacking and developing still.
Mm-hmm. And you say what's needed is the vision.
Yes. Where do we want to go, and are we clear, as Ahmed say, and are we putting exactly on the plan what people needs? So that's exactly what's needed, a vision. Mm-hmm. Where do we want to be?
Great. So I'm going to be talking to each panelist, kind of take you one by one so we can get a bit more in depth into the different areas of expertise and where they've been working. I wanted to mention, I think those of you who are new weren't here for the first panel, we have cards that are on the table. So as the discussion is taking place, if questions come to mind that you'd like to ask, please do be writing on the cards, and we'll be happy to take those, and we'll leave plenty of time to look at some of these questions, as well as some of the questions that we took from the first panel that are relevant to this one. So Ahmed, I wanted to turn to you, because you've been observing this and thinking about the sociocultural field for some time. And I want to get your sense of what exactly is the nature of the change that's taking place today, and what are the primary drivers of that change? Is this something that you think is being driven by the vision itself, or are these things a lot of the changes that we see already had, the seeds were there before and were taking place? So can you just give us kind of a sense and overview of how you see sociocultural change in the kingdom today?
Society is always in flux and it's always changing. Whether there was this vision or not, society was going through its phases of change over time. But what this plan has did is that now they have this framework for where they want to see change on a national level. And if you look at the vision and its goals, they have set very specific goals on the economy. What kind of unemployment rate they see in 2030. What is the debt ratio to the national budget? All these kind of specific numbers that they want to achieve by 2030. But when it comes to the social and cultural consequences that would result from these changes, there isn't a lot of clarity or a lot of discussion in the plan itself. I mean, as Hala mentioned, what happens when you cut subsidies to a segment of society, and how do they deal with that? So to take one big example, one of the main goals for the vision is to increase women participation in the workforce. At the moment, Saudi women unemployment rate is around 36%. That's a very big number, and the government hopes to bring down that number to 7% by 2030. Now, to actually reach that goal, you need to increase women participation in the workforce. But there are all these issues that prevent that now. So, if women still cannot drive, how are they supposed to reach these jobs and go out in the market? The same thing when it comes to issues like restrictions on gender mixing and gender segregation. And the same goes to the issue of male guardianship over women, and can they take jobs if their guardians are against them. So, the government obviously has this goal of pushing for more women employment, but you have these issues that are standing on the way, and the vision doesn't seem to address that very clearly, or talk about it very openly about how it is necessary to make these changes to actually achieve these goals. And as you move forward with the plan, this theme is repeated in my paths, because if you have these goals for the plan and you're trying to move forward with them, but you have these issues standing on the way and you don't have a clear way of addressing them, that would lead to this tension and conflict between your goals and where you want to go and the reality on the ground, especially on the social and cultural issues. Another good example that you mentioned is this government push for having more entertainment options in the country. Last year, the government established this entertainment authority. They're investing a lot of resources in it, and they're pushing to allow more entertainment in the country. And we know that the Deputy Crown Prince himself is very interested in the topic. I remember hearing him in a gathering in Riyadh before the vision was announced in December 2015, and he said that we cannot expect people to be productive if they're not enjoying life in our country. And he admitted that the lifestyle in Saudi cities was just miserable and not suitable for people to actually be happy and productive. And obviously through last year they took these steps to allow for more entertainment options to be there. But what we have seen is that as you allow this, more entertainment to come, that also resulted in a reaction from group society who are opposed to that. There are people who don't see that allowing music concerts is a good thing, that allowing different forms of entertainment, especially those imported from abroad, is a good thing. And so far this resistance or this backlash have been muted, partly because people know that this is the tide and this is where the country is going, so you're careful not to stand in front of a storm. But we can't guarantee that there won't be a more proactive resistance to these actions. I mean, we've seen, for example, last week when the head of the Entertainment Authority gave an interview to Reuters and said something like, well, we're offering all these entertainment options, and if they're not suitable for you, you can stay at home. A lot of people took offense at that, saying, the minister or the head of the authority has no right to tell people, either you enjoy our programming or you can stay at home. But and we've seen statements from the religious establishment, like the Grand Mufti coming out saying, allowing more music and maybe cinema in the future, as Khulud was saying, would be a bad thing, because it would westernize society and change it to the worst according to his perspective. So, so far the government handling of this tension that resulted from allowing more entertainment has been pretty inconsistent, because they don't seem to have a clear plan or a clear approach to how to manage this, conflict that would result from these changes on society and culture. And we've seen that after the head of the authority, the Entertainment Authority, said that, and there was this backlash on social media, he came out with a clarification saying, I didn't mean that people should stay at home. They can go out and have fun. But, that sort of, inconsistent messaging shows that as the government pushes for economic changes, whether it comes to women participation or more entertainment or more culture or allowing more NGOs to operate in the country, all these changes that the government is going to push, this push will lead to issues and conflicts and tension on the cultural and social level. And so far, it doesn't look like there is a very clear path forward on how to deal with these issues that keep coming up and will continue to come up.
Well, can you discuss a bit more? You talked a little bit about some of the conflicts regarding women, or not conflicts, but some of the tensions, which I think are kind of natural to arise if you're having, changes, that there's going to be some resistance to that change. One other area where we're seeing the government take a proactive approach is in arts as well, and we're seeing a lot of interest now in the area of arts and development of artists, and particularly in promoting a lot of this art abroad and seeing that now as a positive vehicle. I know you've looked a lot at art and know some of the artists. Could you talk a little bit about that sector and where the dynamism is coming from and where you see the future in that area?
Sure. I mean, Saudi Arabia was already having a budding and a very growing contemporary art scene even before the vision was announced for a few years now. We've seen big Saudi artists like Ahmed, Abdel Nasser Gharam, and others making a big impact and a big reputation for themselves inside and outside the country. And the government, to its credit, for the last few years, did not try to control or oppress that art scene. But as this art scene continued to grow, and now the government trying to support it and back it, because they also see it as an area where there is potential growth that could contribute to the economy, we will run into the same issues with how much should the government be involved or interfering with an area where free expression is really needed and required. So would artists be comfortable with government backing if this government backing could come with restrictions over what kind of art you can produce or where can you show and exhibit your art? So these issues of free speech and artistic expression will continue to grow up, to happen and occur. I mean, these are issues that happen everywhere, not just in Saudi, but it is more present there because you have a society where there is a very conservative culture that is common, and for artists to challenge that culture and try to break out of it, that would definitely lead to conflict and a reaction. And it would be very interesting to see how would the government decide to react to it. So let's say, for example, a Saudi artist puts an art show together tomorrow, and a group of people see some of that art as offensive. What does the government do? Should they allow that even if some group of society see it as offensive, and say, this is part of free speech that we should support? Or should they be more careful and say, you know what, social peace is more important, let's censor this art show because, the stability and social peace in our society is more important than, the imagination of some artists.
Can you talk a bit, I know because you're involved in media, obviously you're a journalist, and have been a long observer of the development of social media as well in Saudi Arabia. Can you talk a little bit about how this whole new environment of discussion on social media is playing in with the big changes that are taking place? I mean, is there kind of a conversation that's coming out on social media? How is the government kind of seeing that opening and responding actually to some of the demands that they see or discussions that are taking place?
It is common knowledge that Saudis are very active on social media. We have a very vibrant community on Twitter, on Facebook, on many other platforms, and the government seems to have gone through different stages when it comes to how to deal with this with these platforms and how to deal with expression on them. The first instinct is usually be careful or censorship, but now it seems like the government have progressed and reached a stage where they see engagement and being on the platforms as the best way to approach it. What we have seen over the last few years is that you have most government departments, most government officials are on social media. They're pretty active, pretty involved in that, try to be as involved as they can in these conversations. Of course, they're not always good at it, so it can be a tricky balance for them. But again, that happens everywhere because it is such a new thing. And we've also seen that because the government has become more involved and active, we've seen them either taken steps to address what people are saying on social media or incidents that happen on social media. They try to address them. We've seen some ministers losing their jobs because there've been some big backlash on something they said on social media, and we've seen also the government trying to promote their policy and their plans by using social media influencers and people in that scene to try to promote their agenda. So we know that the government know that that's where a lot of these Saudi conversations are happening, because they're not happening in traditional media, and there are not that many avenues in public where you can express that. But social media is where a lot of these conversations are happening, and the government, of course, wants to be part of it.
I just want to underline that, though, because it's really pretty momentous, I think, when you take the whole picture there, that you're getting a reconstitution of a new kind of a Saudi public, in a way, and a voice that can voice itself in ways that you didn't see prior to that time, and a government that's engaging with that public in different ways. So that's definitely one of the changes that we've seen, obviously not just through Saudi Vision 2030, but a new environment that then they have to undertake these changes with that as a given.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let me turn to Lina. I think it would be really great if you can tell us a bit about your experiences before you became on the Shura Council, and talk a little bit about your experiences in founding Jeddah United. And as we talk about kind of this new Saudi Arabia and trying to find new spaces for engagement, I think that this particular story of Jeddah United and how you were trying to bring more opportunity for women in sports is a really fascinating one, and quite illustrative of this move.
Right. Well, I want to say something that I wasn't intending to say at all, but I was really actually inspired at 38,000 feet above sea level as I was flying into Washington, D.C. I watched a movie called Hidden Figures, and it was very inspiring. It was about 3 women in the 60s who went through discrimination at the workforce. I believe they worked in NASA, and the hardships that they went through, and how, just going from one building to the other. Catherine Coleman Johnson, who had to go through the rain just to go to a bathroom, who couldn't use the same coffee pot as her colleagues. Not only was she a woman, but she was also an African-American woman. And the reason why I say I was inspired is because that did not stop her from being basically talented in mathematics and physics, and also led to her getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And when I say this story, I say that there was a lot to learn from that. And I was very inspired because it is not a question, it's a woman, when women evolve, they evolve, and societies have evolved all over the world for women specifically. And when I would like to focus on basically the holistic Saudi Arabia, when you look at it in that perspective. You look at it historically, I have been a sports activist for the past 15 years. And basically, when you look at the history of a 1932-year-old country that is only 85 years old, you look at the first private school that ever opened in Saudi Arabia, which was in 1955-56, and the government-run state only opened up in 1960, late 60s, university for women. And you look at, like, in the 70s and 80s, and then my mother, for example, she worked in the Ministry of Information. She was one of the first radio journalists in Saudi Arabia. My aunt, who worked in the university as a microbiologist. And you look at all these jobs opening up slowly throughout the past decades. And then you see that it was only in 2001 that Saudi women received their national ID cards. When King Abdullah became king in 2005, what happened was he started adding women to the international delegations when he traveled. Then came the historic announcement and the decision to include women in the Shura Council in 2013. Now, that was a paradigm shift for Saudi society because there were no women in the highest consultative council to the king. And 2015 followed the elections for women in the municipality, and women throughout the country were elected in the municipality. And then, honestly, then came Vision 2030 in April 25th in 2016. And at that point, I just felt validation. I felt like everything that I've been working on in the past 15 years, and the struggle to promote awareness about the importance of sports for girls and women, basically that's when I felt like everything that I was working on is not just going to happen in my own small community or the 2 different divisions that we opened up in the big cities, but it's going to be throughout all of Saudi Arabia. And then followed the appointment of Princess Rima bint Bandar as the vice president for the General Sports Authority. That was our Title IX right there. And we were so excited. These were exciting times for us in Saudi Arabia. I mean, in terms of the sports, not just that, but also so many things. I had to get this paper because I really could not keep track. You know, we had in June, we had the National Transportation Program that was the roadmap to how to implement this vision. We had 4 girls entering the Rio de Janeiro Olympics, and that was historic. It was double the amount of athletes who participated in the London Olympics in 2012. You know, you name it. There were, in the financial sector, you had 3 women who basically took over 3 very important positions in the financial sector. You have the head of the stock exchange, CEO of Samba of a bank, and a CFO of another bank. I don't want to keep going on and on, but what I'm trying to say is that history is happening as we speak. I think that the fact that despite the fact that there are, you know, opposing views, I think right now it's just, we can't keep waiting for people who are opposed and trying to, in the past, maybe there has been, okay, we don't want a lot of controversy. Now I think that the country is going on despite opposition from segments. And we had also the first ever female dean in March of 2017. Now I want to end with what you've mentioned is, and I really agree with you on that point, which is a historic rule by the king that the guardianship, the women do not need to get permission from their guardians for services. Obviously, there is a 3-month, there's still, it's being upgraded. It definitely needs the ministries and the government, different agencies to come with what is going on, because there have been a lot of conflicts in what women have been going through from city to city. For example, I've never had to get permission for any hospital, any school, anything that I've ever applied in, but that's a big city. Therefore, I've heard that there are internal regulations that are specific to different, for example, hospitals in different cities and villages. Therefore, what's happening right now, and this is, by the way, according to the Human Rights Watch, it is the 3-month basically period is about upgrading the system in regards to the guardianship. And I think that is, honestly, I have to take that back and say, one of the most important rulings of 2016. Mm-hmm. And that even didn't finish the anniversary. It was the 17th of April, which means that was before the anniversary of Vision 2030. Mm-hmm.
Well, can you tell us, you were just recently appointed to the Shura Council with a new crop of women, mm-hmm. And we were just talking and you were telling me that you feel like it's something really different, the kinds of women that have been appointed and the kind of commitments that are mm-hmm. being made at this point. Can you tell us about some of your, I mean, I know it's new, right. But kind of how you were received on the Shura Council, what you're hoping to achieve on the council, and some right. of your early experiences. I know that you are already pressing some of the things that you're trying to push forward in right. terms of sports and sports education.
Well, it's not just me, but when you look at the different members that have been appointed, a lot of them are from the private sector, younger in age than the previous terms. And this, to me, is an indicator that the government wants change, and that's why they're appointing these different various type of personalities and age groups. And I can tell you that I had a recommendation. First of all, one of the first recommendations I had in the Shura Council was about recycling. So a lot of people, like in the Shura, were looking at me like, "Aren't you the sports person?" I was like, "Yeah, I can talk about recycling." So, recycling. I'm a big person. I'm a green person. I really believe in this globe. When you look at this is something we all share. You know, look at differences in different languages, but at the end of the day, humanity it's important, and everything affects everything. So I'm big on that, and I had a recommendation regarding recycling plastic, and we have to be more aggressive when it comes to recycling. But in regards to sports specifically, I had a recommendation to open up sports sciences for girls. Because if we want to promote it, and we need jobs, and obviously right now what we're going to do is probably recruit, because we don't have that many sports professionals. We don't have departments for PE in universities, or social sciences and social sports management. So it's very important. So this is something that I'm working on. But I really believe that the private sector is not going to wait for the public sector. And I'm sure by next year, I think that a lot of the private universities are going to go ahead with, because 250,000 jobs will be created in the next 2 years if now 250 new clubs for women. This is according to Princess Rima, who's the vice president of the Sports Authority. She said that's going to happen. So that's a great, when you look at Vision 2030, a lot of people look at sports. In the past, it was very limited approach to sports. Oh, girls want to go play basketball. Oh, fine, that's an entertainment. No, that's not entertainment. First of all, we are prevention to the maladies and we are the biggest partners to the Ministry of Health. So you're not looking at just, sports from an entertainment aspect. You're looking from a health perspective, and you're looking at it from an economic perspective. You're looking at job creation. You're looking at also a way of, sports is a multi-million-dollar industry. So it's also a way of, for economic gains. So that honestly has really changed, that very narrow perspective on when you look at women's sports. These are just a few of the recommendations that I.
So now you're saying you're seeing that bigger picture.
Absolutely,
where it fits into the overall economy and transformation. Can you? I can't help but push you just a little bit, because I'm really curious about your own personal experience, though, and both trying to move into this area where I imagine there weren't many people working in the area of women's sports when you initiated Jeddah United,
right.
And now stepping into the Shura Council. Can you give us a sense of what the kind of resistance that you face? I mean, or just to get a picture of what we're looking at in terms of a changing Saudi Arabia. What does it really look like in terms of when you take these steps, how people react? I mean, right. Where do you find support, and where do you find, where do you change minds?
Well, I'm also going to mention an encounter I had in 2008 with Lynette Woodard. Our company brought her in. She was part of the WNBA, and she talked about the struggles that she also had. So I always like to look at history to learn, and women's struggles, whether in sports or just in general on the political level. And basically, when I first started the team, I started because I couldn't go back to school. Having been graduated from a private school, we had sports programs. But then after that, what do? Okay, I was a fresh graduate. I wanted to play basketball. So I was like, okay, it's not game over when you're 22. You still have to, you want to play. So I started this team. And for 3 years, I played. I just, called in my ex-teammates and my family and friends. And until one day, my mother came up to me and she's like, when are you going to get a job? I was like, oh God, I definitely need to get a job, because I was a new mother. There were no nurseries at the time. She was a working grandmother. Anyways, so it took me 3 years until everyone was like, there is no such thing as women federations. There are no licenses for women clubs. We still have not received, our licenses are gonna happen this month, supposedly. So at that time, there was no way for it to happen. But I really think that if you really are persistent, and if you really want something, then you're always going to find a way to do it. And I did. I went through the Ministry of Commerce, and I went through the Chamber of Commerce, and I was like, okay, I want to start a company, get a license, and it was through training. So training doesn't say sports training. You when you want to organize events, it doesn't have to specify that it's an event. So that's how I went about it. There was a loophole in the system, and I was able to go through that and establish a sports company that does training and sports event, sports management, and the rest is history.
Well, let's turn to Hala. I know, Hala, that you've been working as well for a long time in the field of health, working as well with the government in this field. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what you learned from that work? And also give us a picture of, as we see these kind of changes taking place and these incremental reforms, maybe that'll give us a broader sense of kind of what we're up against in terms of what you've seen, what barriers exist in terms of women kind of being able to fully participate in the economy.
Right, so one of the main things, as I've mentioned, is the idea that women could not commute or have autonomy to be part of not only of the work opportunities, but in life in general. So it's one of the main issues of, when you talk about society as well, it's the embedment of the society as well. One of the main issues as well is how to engage people in creating the society that they aspire for. The one important thing that was mentioned by Lina is how she went ahead and struggled and started and lobbied the support and help of a good network of people eventually until she found that loophole. So the idea is how to make it easier for people with ideas who can transform that need into actions and who can basically channel their energy into something that is constructive for the society. Going to the idea of how the civil society could be influential in shaping its own policies and regulations. And it goes not only for women, but for men as well, and for youth, for artists as well. So where are the voices of those people? Most of the problems that happen online and on ideas of freedom of expression, it does not happen because people are speaking about issues. It happens because there is a lot of tension when these ideas are faced by blocks in the reality, and there is no reception to those ideas, and there is no mechanisms and means for them to transform those ideas into realities. There has been some campaigns by other women who have researched, who have worked on the ideas of how to empower certain sects of society, not only in sport or arts, but in all major areas. Finding that the only venue available for them is the social media, and their voices might not be transformed into action. They might not have the networks to make it happen. And they are faced sometimes by the electronic committee, what we call as the electronic committee, where people are trying to silence you or trying to wash you as, basically getting you out of the conversation. When it comes to women and work and women autonomy, one of the main challenges is women decisions or a choice, the right to choose, basically. So this is built in the laws and regulation and the customs that governs the women's position in the family. In 2012, Jeddah Chambers of Commerce created a survey on 3,000 men and women, whereby they've asked them about the perceptions on women in the public places, whether as leaders or as part of the workforces. The majority of men did not have any problem with women leading, basically, public offices or being part of the public life. Women have identified issues that the civil society have been raising and talking about for ages. The lack of daycare facilities that was affordable and suitable at the workplaces, the lack of affordable transportation, and the personal status law that might sometimes make them choose things not because these are the works that would suit their capacity and skills, but it is what is required by their family. So having to liberate women from those kinds of issues, and it is a public health issue when women needs are conflicting with those of their family, where violence sometimes is being used to control the position of women within the family, and with the lack of regulations and laws that would protect women, that would not be constructive to having those women do something about those issues. So I think mainly the idea of working on those issues that impede women in terms of personal status law, recognizing the capacity of women and the rights to women to choose whatever profession or whatever public role they want to play, and to empower them within the family first, not in the public life only. The other thing is to remove those impediments, as my colleagues have said, and I think a lot of people have been talking about it. We perceive the Saudi society as conservative society, but research and polls shows a different story. when the entertainment committee started, launching conferences and performances in major Saudi cities, all the tickets were sold out. People have been really picking up on those opportunities. Saudis are, the prime tourists in all the neighboring countries. And I think part of the entertainment committee is to generate revenues inside Saudi Arabia and not to waste those revenues because people are traveling outside and spending their money in Egypt or Dubai or other countries. So I think the idea that Saudi society is conservative in what and to what extent? So this is like a big word, a big buzzword that is kept on being mentioned in the media in order to give a false impression that they will not be open to reform. While the reality, if you follow the social media trends, if you follow what people are saying, if you follow the initiatives that people have been trying to put up, sport initiative for women, for instance, or women trying to walk on the streets to make sure that their voices and their needs are being heard and taking videos of themselves doing so. So all these initiatives tells you a different story. So I think it's the idea that the society is conservative. The society is not conservative when it comes to having more engagement in their decision making, having more engagement in shaping their own policies and making their being part of the solutions of their own problems, which we did not see till now. So having people, but of course you get some kind of response sometimes, though it is not to the level that people aspire to. Mm-hmm. So I do give credit to people who have lobbied for the guardianship, and some of them are Dr. Abed and other women who have been in the Shura, who have spoken the issue to the media in 2014, and the other activists, and I'm one of them, who have lobbied internationally and inside Saudi Arabia, in the UN or Human Rights Council, other places, to push for those issues. It takes time, as Lina have mentioned, and that time is a waste of resources. So all these people are part of those conservative societies. It's not like those people were created in a different country. So when we say conservative, what do we mean? Who are the conservative people? Is it that we're talking about conservative people who are not the people who demand for these things? So it's just like you're selecting a group of this society to demand or to decide on issues that is of importance and relevance to everyone. So I would be very cautious in referring to how conservative the society is in areas of important reforms, in areas of human development. So we don't want to be left at this time and age where Saudi Arabia, despite the resources invested in so many domains, as one of the lowest in human development index when it comes to employment, for instance, or when it comes to infrastructure, or when it comes to arts or revenues, or having women be part of the decision making. I see this as a very modest approximation, when only 5% of women are supposed to be in leadership position by 2030, or 8% only increase of women employment in 2030, and yet without addressing those root causes of impediment, women were not we were not going to achieve this modest number of a percentage of 8%. So I think we need to think more than to keep on saying that the society is conservative, and this is what we need to expect, a gradual pace of reform. And I think it really discredit the action of civil society. And I think a better approach is to enable those civil society to be part of decision making and to listen to what they find and what they call for.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, I just want to throw this out there, but it's interesting that as you're talking, I'm thinking that it gives a different taste to Saudi society, and I think what a lot of you are doing and presenting Saudi as society, we're seeing it in a much less simplistic way. But I'm also wondering how much that is coming from actual changes that are happening, generational changes that are happening in Saudi society. I remember when I was meeting with a lot of youth activists, and they told me that when people wanted to be engaged before, people that were very public-minded, and they would go to seek things to do. I mean, they want to be active in a public, social way, right? Not just in their homes. They would find that the only things that they could participate in were things that were basically run by Islamist networks. I mean, they weren't even identified as that. People didn't even know that they were being drawn into these things. But there was not much opportunity to have this kind of public participation.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that is changing. I mean, if they're opening up more spaces for people to do different things through NGO laws, through maybe having a more open attitude towards arts.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the society will also shift in different ways through the influences that are there?
One important thing is to think about how those laws will enable the civil society and whether those laws are actually trying to work on the issue of freedom of expression so that the extremists are not the only voice that is heard. I do admit that there are the charity, for instance, the social services, the legal sector by large, are those sectors which are dominated by hardliners. And those are the most resistant to reforms. But I do believe that there is a leverage there of the king and of the ruling family to invest more in reforming those ideas. We've seen that happening in UAE when Abdullah bin Biya was hosted as basically Illuminati, if you would think of it, for the religious thoughts. This person who has been part of the Islamic revival, basically, theories and thoughts, have been part of the public policy. He has not been placed in a corner where his daily work is looking into opinions of historical Muslim scholars. This person have been part of the work of the government. He's been sitting with policy planners on so many different issues, on health, on education, on urban planning, and he gained, this kind of exposure that would enable him to review his scholarly thoughts and come up with more of a moderate and progressive schools of thoughts. So Abdullah bin Biya is a good example how you can balance and neutralize the extremist ideology. And in Saudi Arabia, we do not see that happening. But I do have a lot of friends in Saudi Arabia, and you have met some of them, who are trying to create those kinds of new version to how we think about Islam, how we think of the position of Islam from so many different things. But these people are not part of the official institutions, and they are not empowered. It goes back to the idea, how do we empower the actors within the civil society so that they can be part of this change, so that they can neutralize those kinds of ideologies, so that when they speak on Twitter or on the salons, for instance, in a public bookstore or something, they're not being targeted or suspended. How can we make their voices utilized to empower and vitalize the government basically into more of a progressive and reformative agenda? So these people are not part of the decision making, and we have been, all of Saudi knows exactly where are the hardliners in the government, and unfortunately nothing has been done to challenge their power. I think the government is somehow trapped between the risk of security and the risk of basically economic disadvantage. For economic advantage, they will need to create more of a reformative agenda. In order to do that, they need to revisit their positions on so many issues that are religiously constrained. And they're not really doing what's needed. Until now, I see that what they do is they create a parallel institutions, ad hoc institutions. And instead of dealing with those institutions, we'll just leave those institutions function and doing religious edicts, which are very much retarded and backwarded. But we're going to bring, for instance, a media channel where we host one of those for one event or something, but preaching to the liberal people, not preaching to those institutions, you see. Or creating courts that would look into labor disputes or into the commercial dispute. And instead of having the courts system itself being modernized and regulated and codified according to international standards. The National Committee for Human Rights, for instance, have published a study in 2014, in which they reviewed all the regulations inside Saudi Arabia. They've come up with what is inconsistent with the country's commitments, basically, or international commitments to under the international law, the conventions and treaties. And they've laid out very good rationale and reasoning. They put a lot of resources in doing so. And hereby you see even those government organizations that are sponsored by the government are not talking to each other. So creating these kinds of organizations which will review the government performance, but not having those recommendations be part and parcel of the reforms agenda. So yes, there are Islamist networks which are empowered and unofficial and functioning to resist whatever changes to their own power and to their own domains. But on the other side, there are other networks. There are other people who are trying to do something, but they don't have the advantage of the historical advantage of the Islamist network. And they can't really do much under the restrictive environment that they live in.
Well, I'm going to start to welcome questions, but before we get to the questions, I wanted to see if Lina or you or Ahmed have thoughts about this general question about generational change and what you see happening in Saudi Arabia today.
70% of the, Dr. Sagar said, 70% of the population is under the age of 35. This is a very young generation. Yeah. It's the youngest generation in the world. So this is our human resource. And not only that, they're also 70% of the Facebook, the Twitter, the social media. They're so exposed. So an 18-year-old today is a 30-year-old in the past generation. They're so much more aware, and it's a different mindset. It's a different mentality. And I think that the exposure is going to be a big force for them to really even do much more than we have done. I really believe so. That's just my thought on it.
Ahmed, did you want to add something?
That's true, but I also think this comes down to the question of empowerment. So yes, you do have a young generation that is much more educated, much more open to the world, much more engaged, and they want to be more proactive about changing the country and moving it forward. But then you also have a lot of entrenchment in government institutions, in the private sector by the older generation. And there is this tension between allowing the younger generation to be more involved in decision making, and between keeping things the way they are and maintaining the status quo. So, in theory, you would think because it is the younger generation is the majority, they will have the last word one day. But it is a struggle. It's not an easy transition between this older generation that has been in charge for a long time and the younger generation who really wants and desire change, but it's not just up to them to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. But I think, just adding to that, if you look at the average age of our ministers in the past, I've heard it was 65. I think that's an exaggeration. But you have ministers who are in their 30s today. And this is definitely a big shift in terms of putting somebody that young in a ministry level. So yeah, not maybe in all the different government agencies, but you'll find agencies that have very young ministers.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to start looking at some of these questions as we continue our discussion, and one is very much right along the lines of the conversation we were having, I guess a bit more specific. It says that Saudi Arabia is a conservative culture. Its laws also enshrine restrictions on arts expression through criminalizing blasphemy, using counterterrorism law in ways that restrict freedom of speech. And the question then is, do you see any opening for legal reform? So reform in the legal system, which is kind of the issue I think you were talking about, Hala, in terms of the strength of conservative in certain areas of government.
Yeah, I think there are actually a lot of push on that direction. Now, the legal sector has been, as I said, the most resistant to codification and to change and to examine their position. But again, I wouldn't say it's the legal sector, and when it comes to freedom of expression, it's again the political authority. So coming to the anti-terror law definitely is not a legal thing. It's not a legal sector basically mandate. It's the Ministry of Interior basically creation. So I think it goes back to the idea of those kind of boundaries between places. So, or for instance, how much are we going to, or are we eager to drive as a government? Are we eager to drive the innovation and the arts and the culture and the examination of basically literary examination? And how much are we willing to sacrifice challenging the status quo? So this is something that is not yet, of course, on the table. So there are red lines still, even for journalists inside Saudi Arabia. Sometimes you will see, for instance, some articles that are very progressive, but there are always red lines, and you would never know when is something said that would be offensive to the authorities. But I know that there has been some kind of a push, at least from several institutions. The Human Rights Commission, for instance, was tasked of looking into a national plan to coordinate across different ministries in order to bring them into the international conventions and treaties. Granted, that is not a job only of the government. I want to impress again and again on creating a civil society space so that the government is not the initiator, the executive, and the arbiter, basically, or the performance evaluator. So people who are at the other end of those services should be part and parcel of all those processes. And that cannot happen without empowering the civil society, empowering them to monitor, to think, and to research, and to be part of those kinds of reforms. And that is not happening. But of course, I know that there is a lot of pressure on the Ministry of Justice to bring their procedure. What happens to date is that their procedural laws are being devised, but not the codes, the criminal codes. There is a lot of authorities given still to judges, and that really compromises justice as we know it, and the commitments of the state towards justice. So I think there's a very reasonable concern here, and we've seen, of course, a lot of cases where those issues have been really unresolved.
And just to follow up on that, I think the government finds itself in a very awkward position when it comes to reform in the judiciary.
Yeah.
It has been a long time coming. The projects have been announced a long time ago. The government wants to invest a lot into reforming the judiciary, but for reasons that you mentioned, there's resistance from within to these changes and reforms. And then the government also seems reluctant about trying to force change very quickly in an institution that requires stability. And also, they don't want to appear as if they're interfering with the judiciary. Now, sure, the principle of maintaining the judiciary independence is important, but you're also running into issues because the judges have very wide power or discretion to give these sentences, resulting to unresolved cases and issues, as Hala said.
I have another question. How can the government ensure reforms work for Saudi residents across socioeconomic strata? And I think that's a good question. A lot of times reforms take place, and maybe you can talk a bit about that too. I know, Ahmed, in terms of the arts or in terms of sports, and reach only a very limited number of people. So how can these sort of reforms reach different classes and different regions, I think, in Saudi Arabia, as you were mentioning? Lina, do you want to address that?
Well, right now, I mean, even when you go and you walk by the beach, there are so many more activations for a lot of different, like I visited the city of Yombor, and there were so many festivals like in the streets. It wasn't for a certain class, it was really for everybody. To go in and enjoy. And don't forget, one of the very, very important objectives of the vision is to have UNESCO sites that is also, and obviously increase tourism. So these initiatives are going to also support the vision in terms of like having Saudi Arabia an open country for tourists, so they can come and see for themselves and not just see it in the news or read it in the paper, but also come and experience for themselves the heritage, because it's not just Islamic heritage. We have ancient heritage, and this is something that was also stated very clearly in the vision. And I think having different spaces, like just in public areas, and it has started. I mean, you find trucks in the streets right now. They've given them licenses to for food trucks. That wasn't available in the past. It was only this year that you have people who just want to sell cookies on the sidewalk or whatever. So this is, I think it's really good. It's a great step, and you're going to see more and more of it.
I think when it comes to making sure that the government programming is reachable to everyone, yes, traditionally it has been an issue for the government to ensure that their services and their programming is reachable to people, not just in the big cities, but also across the country and to different social classes. And yes, there is a concern now as the government moves forward with these reforms that will include a lot of privatization of government institutions, and even initiatives like the Entertainment Authority seems to be really driven by a business mentality. There is a concern that these changes will exclude some segments of society or will not be inclusive to some. So that's something that the government should seriously think about and make sure that the impact of these changes and the steps that are taken are considered in their effect on different groups of society. Again, it seems it's kind of go back to where we started. As you move forward with these economic changes, you really need to look into the social and cultural consequences of what you're doing. And that's an area where a lot more work should be done.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing, basically, is we've seen Twitter has been really the site where people are issuing their grievances, whether because of Article 77 of the labor law, which goes to so many people working in the private sector to be laid off, which then prompted the Shura Council to meet with those people and to revise Article 77. So instead of people having to know how to on Twitter to create a social campaign to issue their grievances, I think we need more regulations to ensure that these voices of people are heard, especially when economic plans are relying so much on major companies and investments, not necessarily taking into account the voices of the workers themselves, but more the voices of the investors and what do they need. We need to create an enabling environment for investors, but what about the workers, the labor workers? And certainly over the last year, we've seen a lot of them have been going on the streets for protest, and there has been some kind of issues in that regard. I would say unions are a wonderful start, but if unions are very difficult, then we need to have civil society again to monitor. And so I can't really stress enough on the voices of people finding a place that is legitimate, that is regulated, and that is heard and not restricted by the government. Not only for the government to enact a very effective reform, but to keep the checks and balances along the process, which would be a trial and error.
Lina, you mentioned tourism, and you talked about it in terms of international tourism, but I was curious about the potential for tourism to get Saudis to travel within the kingdom. Because one other thing I was struck by was that people in Saudi Arabia don't know necessarily a lot of different areas. And, is that something that has some potential? Is that something that the government is hoping to do?
It is, absolutely. There's a lot of, they're upgrading a lot of like the hotel sites, the different, the sites, like we have 4 different UNESCO sites. One is Old Jeddah, one is Dar'iyya, 2 others in Medina, Mada al Saleh, and I think the 4th in Hassa, if I'm not mistaken. And basically, so these are, it would make more sense for the Saudis to visit the UNESCO sites within their own country. And I think there's a lot of effort in terms of promoting it, not just for international community, but also to the local community. And when I read it, when I realized that, I need to go to these sites personally, on a personal level, I was like, wow. I mean, okay, I went to 2 out of 3, but still there's one more that I need to go to. It's just an example to how it has, even on a personal level, motivated me to go ahead and check it. And there's one they're working on up north in Tabuk with a lot of archaeologists. I think they're German archaeologists. So there's a lot that's going to be happening. I think within the next year, you'll be hearing more and more of sites that are going to be tourist areas, both for Saudis and people from the region and even international.
And how does this play into another thing, a trend that I've seen in Saudi Arabia that very much affects society and maybe even the space for participation, and that is kind of a strengthening of a Saudi identity, kind of a national identity. We have a question here, which has been partially addressed, I think, but it says, no one has mentioned the role of the religious institutions in defining social, cultural, political norms today. Has religion, meaning Wahhabi institution itself, that normally is, looms very large in our discussions of Saudi Arabia, lost its ability to influence public attitudes and government policies? Right. And I'm wondering about that interplay between this new national identity and the more traditional authority that has been held in scholars and in the religious authorities in Saudi Arabia.
Right, I think he or she said it. It's stated that the religious police, or the institution that is basically stripped out of its powers, because that's definitely something of the past. Today, there is no such thing as religious authority that are monitoring people in the streets. that may have happened in the past, but definitely not anymore. So I think it's one of the, one of the accomplishments of Vision 2030 that talking about, you have we want a minister for happiness, and you want people to have a good quality of life and to feel positive and productive and be able to live a normal life. And that's definitely something that has happened, and it was a great thing, I think.
Any other thoughts on that question of the remaining strength of religious institutions? I think we've talked about it a little bit in terms of the judiciary, but in the broader picture.
All right, so I think it's going to be, well, the vision did talk about us as an Islamic nation, that this is one of the main pillars. We have 3 pillars in the vision. One of them is our regional, position among the 3 continents, and one of them is our Arabic identity and Islamic leadership. So I think it is important for the institutions, for the ruling, at least for the government or for the ruling elite, is to have this kind of and you've seen that happening over the last year, that any attempts to foreign policy is usually attempted as a coalition of Islamic states or a coalition of Muslim countries. Even Trump visit is a Trump visit to the leadership of the Muslim countries, which I think it's not going to go away. It's going to be part defining element of Saudi Arabia. But how is that being played? Is it a Wahhabi institution, or is it going to be transforming into more of the Azhar maybe style of a passive religious institution that would not be involved in politics and more so involved in issuing fatwa or things like that in social issues? That might be the direction where we're heading. And I think that's what was meant since the 60s in institutionalizing the religious authorities in Saudi Arabia, but it took us quite a long time. But basically, as I think, like most of the nations, religion has been a very important tool to define identity and to gain power. But for the average Saudi, a lot of the people in Saudi Arabia are very much diverse. They're not defining themselves as Wahhabis or Salafis, or even those who are Wahhabis are refusing that term. So refuse to be branded as Wahhabis, I mean. Yeah. So I think it's what our main concern as citizens, or at least from my own perspective, is that knowing that even though this is a defining element of the state, basically as the leader of the Sunni state or Islamic state, how much does that impact the human development? How much does that impact us as a country who wants to be secure on so many levels, on gender equality, on health, on reforms, and legal? If that is something that is kept as an identity, for instance, for our own beliefs in Islam, like if it's not going to be impinging a certain religious opinion that would be very restrictive to how policies are being made, that I think is a positive thing. I think it's going to be staying. It's not going to...
No, but I think, as you said, it seems that we're moving in that direction by which the religious establishment plays a role that is still important, but less proactive into shaping policy. The government is really, taking charge in that direction. And yes, they do pay attention to what does the religious establishment, the clergy think, but they do not necessarily follow their advice.
That's been the case.
That has been the case for a long time.
More and more so
but
now.
It seems they're more open, more open about it now than before.
But I think also the fact that Saudi Arabia is 100% a Muslim country, that is obviously why they are looking at it as a pillar, because that's like 100% of the population. And in terms of Wahhabi, I think that for mainstream Islam, there were only 4 schools of thought, and Wahhabi is not a school of thought. It's not a recognized school of thought. It's just philosophy of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and that has nothing to do with the rest of the Muslim world. It was just in a specific region, and whatever it is, if it is associated with basically unflexible interpretation of Islamic text, it's gone. It's really over. Maybe that was the case that he had followers in the past, but honestly, not anymore. not in line with the 70% of the new Saudis that are basically on Instagram and Snapchat. I assure you, that's definitely not the case today. I mean, I have a 14-year-old daughter, and all her friends, and it's just really a new Saudi Arabia. And in the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's going to be very challenging, because I remember studying in communication, theories of communication, how people want to preserve their identity. And when McDonald's opened up, or was about to open up in France, there were threats that they were going to burn it. And the reason why I said that is because I think identity is very important in any country. It's nice to feel pride in your identity. And I think that also is the reason why a lot of people are so skeptical and aggressive when it comes to, for example, going back to sports. I think a lot of people thought, oh, if we get the girls to play basketball, or if we get them into sports, they're going to go play beach volleyball, which is not the case. You have a lot of Muslim countries, and not everybody indulges in beach volleyball. It's even by conservative American standards, it's even not accepted in some of the American families today. And I have a lot of American friends, and definitely don't want to have sports from a sensual aspect and using women in that sense. So I think that it's going to be interesting. It's fun times, and it's going to be challenging to have the beauty of having a melange between modernity, education, progressiveness, yet preserving the identity and the cultural aspect of the Saudi society.